December road below zero, cold snap. Engineers huddle around a Chevy C-dump truck. Its inline hasn't been started in weeks. Oil's like molasses. They jump it, and it roars to life. No choke, no throttle, just raw Detroit iron-defying physics. This wasn't luck. It was immortal. You couldn't kill them if you tried. Two inline six monsters forged in Detroit steel and baptized in motor oil. They went head-to-head for decades in America's farms, factories, and freight yards. This isn't technical specs at a corporate thriller with smoking gun documents and visceral eyewitness accounts. The ending doesn't just ask what if. It proves the cover-up. They were Detroit's dirtiest secret, so brutally overbuilt they could outlive the trucks they powered. But the untold truth, Ford and Chevy deliberately strangled them. Why? Because these sixes could have killed the van and cost them billions. Engineering rivalry, the minds behind the monsters. The year war between Ford and Chevrolet birthed some of the most legendary iron to ever roll off an assembly line. But while muscle cars grabbed headlines and VS got the glory, deep in the guts of the real working world, two inline sixes were quietly building reputations that would outlive most of the trucks they powered. Chevy struck first. Birth of beasts, the engineers who defied management. Cole's team knew they'd built a monster. 7 main bearings. Forged crank in stroke. But when Cole presented dyno sheets showing Epless horsepower potential, GM brass slammed the vault shut. Why? An internal memo leaked in says it all. Output capped at horsepower. Must not exceed base VNO. High revving screams here. This thing grunted like a mule at RPM and kept pulling long after your V threw a rod. They didn't live in garages. It lived on the job inside tow trucks, farm rigs, delivery vans, and railroad service vehicles. It didn't ask for chrome, just oil and a fresh belt every now and then. In towns across the Midwest and deep into Texas, legends grew. People told stories of running on no coolant, hauling hay across desert flats, or towing campers twice their weight without a grunt of complaint. Quote from Donnie Miller, retired rancher. I had a Quithe that truck rolled through fires, floods, hell, and divorce court. I wrecked that truck, but that engine still started first crank. Ford's response, the masterminded by engineer Del Harder's team, father of Ford's OVs, it was a stroked with a inch bore, larger than the allowing bigger valves for low RPM breathing. Mechanics nicknamed it the brick for its pound weight. One test engineer's journal entry read, "We ran it at max load for hours. It didn't flinch." The endurance exceeds all projected service life models. Potential performance applications are not recommended at this time. When they arrived, everything changed. It didn't come to Win Street races or Land magazine covers. It came to do work, the kind that breaks men and machines. This wasn't a car engine dressed in truck clothes. It was purpose-built, engineered from the crank up the haul, pull, idle for days, and start cold every single morning without complaint. Ford's design philosophy with the was simple: versatility and longevity. To the untrained eye, the Ford and Chevy were just blue-collar engines born for fleet trucks, delivery vans, and farm duty. But under their grime-covered exteriors lurked engineering so overbuilt, so brilliantly intentional, they weren't just survivors. They were ticking performance time bombs waiting for someone to unleash them. Ford's, with its beefy L displacement, cranked out pound-feet of torque at a lazy RPM in its later fuel-injected versions. Though its horsepower didn't scream race car, Chevy's just a hair smaller at L. Pushed horsepower at RPM and pound-feet at RPM in its best factory tune. These weren't peaky high-rung racers. They were down-low bruisers tuned to twist axles and move mountains without breaking a sweat. And yet, they could have been so much more. Both engines had cast iron blocks so thick you could weld a bracket to them with a blowtorch, and they'd still run cool. The Ford's 7 main bearing crankshaft was so stable, some drag racers swapped them into turbo builds without blinking. Meanwhile, Chevy's lighter for main setup gave it better rev potential, especially when balanced and ported. The engineering differences are fascinating. Ford's had a bigger in-bore compared to Chevy's, and a longer in-stroke versus the Ford's larger bore gave it a breathing advantage. It could gulp in air like a linebacker after a sprint. It also had larger intake valves, giving it better volumetric efficiency at low speeds. Chevy's, however, was all about balance. Its intake manifold was a masterclass in making sure all 6 cylinders got their fair share of air and fuel. Avoiding the common inline flaw of starved end cylinders, while Ford's exhaust setup cut back pressure with carefully tuned runners, compression ratios. Chevy's ranged from 2, depending on the year and use, while Ford kept things steady at tow for efficiency. They were dialed in to make these engines reliable workhorses, but with room to grow if you knew how to unlock it. Fuel and ignition evolution. Chevrolet's was a product of simpler times, and it wore that simplicity like a badge of honor. From its birth in to its final breath in the earlies, they remained carbureted. Early models ran Rochester single or 2-barrel carbs, dependable but far from refined. By the S, Mexican-built versions were saddled with emissions tweaks, air injection ports, PCV systems, and throttle limiters that strangled its once proud torque curve. Ignition started with classic point-style distributors known for their mechanical honesty and their need for constant fiddling. By the late S, GM introduced high-energy ignition, adding reliability, but not much tuning flexibility. Where Chevy stuck to its guns, Ford played the long game, and it paid off. They began with Carter and Holley carburetors, much like its rival, but in Ford made a move that changed everything. TBI, throttle body injection. Suddenly, the INLINE that once relied on gaskets and guesswork could measure airflow, adjust fuel delivery, and trim emissions all on the fly. Alongside TBI came computer-controlled ignition, a leap forward in precision, starting, and dependability. It meant smoother cold starts, better fuel economy, and no more crawling under the hood to gap points in the rain. The TBI system gave Ford the edge, especially in fleet and utility markets where emissions mattered more than brute horsepower. They stayed mechanical, raw, and analog to the end. And that's exactly why gearheads still love it. There's something satisfying about tuning a car by ear, tweaking timing with a twist of the distributor, and hearing the old beast respond like a loyal dog. But the IT paved the road to the future. Its computer brain and precise fuel metering didn't just extend its life. It made it relevant deep into the S, in a world that no longer tolerated unburned hydrocarbons or unreliable cold starts, durability and real-world abuse. And man, were they built to last. The Chevy wasn't just built. It was forged like a sledgehammer designed to swing forever. This wasn't an engine that whispered, growled, and underneath that growl was the kind of engineering that made it nearly unkillable. At the heart of the toughness was its cast iron block reinforced like a bridge support. It used 7 massive main bearings, 7 to cradle. The crankshaft like a vault holds treasure. That extra support spread the stress across the entire bottom end, eliminating flex and preventing catastrophic failure. Even under brutal towing conditions or steep climbs with a fully loaded flatbed, the long stroke was no accident. At in, it delivered neck-snapping torque down low, right where trucks needed it. Sure, a long stroke can cause torsional vibration at high RPM, but that didn't need to scream. It was a low-rev brute living comfortably below RPM, that sweet spot. It's where torque ruled and wear stayed minimal. And unlike many engines that relied on cast cranks, that had a forged steel crankshaft, a part that looked like it came off a tank turret. Forging compresses the metal grain, making the crank incredibly resistant to fatigue and perfect for engines that live under heavy load. It could take punishment for decades and keep spinning true. Chevy didn't stop there. It featured longer connecting rods than its smaller siblings. That longer rod reduced piston side loading, meaning less wear on the cylinder walls over time, less friction, less scuffing, and longer life. This mattered when the engine spent its life pulling trailers, turning irrigation pumps, or hauling lumber up logging trails. The engine's tall deck block wasn't just to make room for that longer stroke. It added serious structural rigidity. The extra deck height gave the thicker cylinder walls and reinforced main bearing webbing, which meant fewer cracks, less warping, and a lower chance of failure. Even when running hot in a desert or cold on a frozen mountain pass. Like its Chevy rival, the Ford was overbuilt to a fault, anchored by 7 massive main bearings that locked its forged steel crankshaft into place like the bars of a bank vault. This wasn't just engineering, it was insurance. The crank could take a beating from dump truck torque without flexing, rattling, or quitting. It was built for war zones, oil fields, lumber yards, and farm roads. At cubic inches, Ford's torque beast balanced muscle with manners. Its stroke was shorter than the inverses, but that gave it an edge. Less vibration, more RPM headroom, and smoother operation at higher speeds. They could comfortably run up to RPM without breaking a sweat, which made it surprisingly versatile. Smooth in a van, brutal in a truck. The forged crankshaft was a masterpiece of raw toughness, resisting fatigue and flex like a heavyweight boxer, shrugging off punches. And while its connecting rods were shorter than the which did slightly increase side loading on the cylinder walls, Ford compensated with a thick reinforced block that could absorb the stress like armor plating. The block itself was a beast. About pound of cast iron conviction. Ford didn't shave weight, they stacked armor. This engine was meant to run irrigation pumps in heat day after day and keep on ticking. That extra mass came with benefits. Its beefy cylinder walls, oversized coolant passages, and main bearing caps that laughed at pressure. Whether it was idling all day in a UPS van or redlining up a grade with 3 tons of hay behind it, they never begged for mercy. The mechanical mules. The Chevy wasn't just an engine. It was a mechanical mule bred to carry impossible loads through dirt fields and dusty towns. On forums like the two present Chevrolet and GMC truck message board network, you'll find mechanics, farmers, and truckers swapping tales like war veterans. One user describes a crane truck that hauled overloaded bins every fall for years. No rebuild, just oil valves and vibes. You'll find still roaring inside old Gleaner and John Deere combines, pounding away in fields thick with dust and heat. Thousands of hours, zero mercy, and still they never grenaded. Why? It comes down to brutal simplicity and bulletproof bones. 7 beefy main bearings to spread the load and silence the crank. Forged steel crankshaft that laughs at heavy torque. Long connecting rods to reduce piston slap and wall scoring. At a carbureted setup so simple it could be rebuilt with a screwdriver and a prayer. They ran on low-octane gas, dirty oil, and neglect, and still refused to die. In stationary setups like irrigation pumps, these engines often ran non-stop for decades, needing little more than a wrench and oil can. Nicknamed the million-mile motor, that built its legacy in UPS vans, FS, Econolines, and anything else built to be flogged daily. Enthusiasts on Ford Truck Enthusiast forums recall these inline brutes clocking 2 million miles with little more than spark plugs and oil, though was made for battle. 7 main bearings just like the 4 crankshaft com under chaos. A beefy block weighing over a pound built to shrug off stress. Forged internals that laughed at detonation and high load. When Ford added throttle body injection in it, sealed the deal. Carburetor headaches gone. Now they could adapt to elevation, heat, load, and abuse, like a thinking beast with a steel brain. Its port cylinder head improved airflow and kept things cool, even under heavy load. No hot spots, no blown gaskets, just smooth torque. LB feed at just RPM. All day, every day. In industrial gear like generators and water pumps, ran for years without shutdowns, according to field techs from the S&S. Endurance in the real world. Both could shrug off overheating thanks to smart designs. Ford with its massive cooling jackets around each cylinder. Chevy with killer oil flow to the valves. Fleet records from the S&S show the Ford averaging me before major work and the Chevy at better than most verses of the era. Even with less TLC, sure, the Chevy's timing gears could wear out early at high miles. And the Ford sometimes leaked from its front seal, but those were easy fixes for engines that just refused to quit. Born in the analog age, the Chevy was made for mechanics who learned on the job. It's not by plugging into diagnostics, but by listening to ticking lifters and sniffing unburnt fuel. Its carbureted soul and points-based ignition, later upgraded to electronic, make it easy to maintain with basic hand tools and a good ear. Oil changes every to me, keep it humming. Valve adjustments every to me, ensure the old iron breathes right. And when it starts running rich or stalling at idle, a screwdriver and a few minutes on the Rochester will usually fix it. This is field serviceable power, the kind you can revive in a barn or on the roadside with nothing but grit and a flashlight. Early are beloved for one reason: ease of access. The separate intake and exhaust manifolds make upgrades, porting, or replacements a breeze. Carb swaps simple, distributor changes a walk in the park. Need a new gasket set? AutoZone probably still has it. GM's massive aftermarket means you never more than a weekend away from breathing new life into a tired engine. Later, we're smogged and muffled by design. Integrated intake manifolds, extra emissions plumbing, and complexity that makes some mechanics groan. But those one-piece heads are efficient for emissions? Yes, but if they crack, you're in for a harder and costlier repair. Upgrading is trickier, though, not impossible for the diehards. Still, even these smog soldiers can be resurrected. They may not breathe like their older cousins, but they've still got that DNA. Its issues are rarely catastrophic. Oil leaks from old gaskets are common after decades, but easily fixed. Carburetor wear or clogged jets from bad fuel can be cleaned and rebuilt. Harmonic balancer failure in high RPM builds is rare, but real and avoidable with a good aftermarket replacement. Keep an eye on timing gears and seals, but even then, they usually warn you before they go. Corporate sabotage. The tech they buried. On paper, the Chevy and Ford were built like tanks. Thick cast iron blocks, forged steel cranks, 7 main bearings, and industrial-grade cooling. They could take beings most engines wouldn't survive. But under the hood, their full potential was never truly unleashed. Why? Because they weren't just engines. They were victims of corporate strategy. The S&S, American auto giants, weren't just selling cars. They were selling hierarchies. At the top, V-powered models with chrome badges and premium pricing. Inline sixes, those were entry-level, basic, blue-collar. The N were never supposed to be stars. They were built to quietly tow, haul, and idle forever, not steal attention. But internally, things looked very different. Declassified internal memos and engineering records unearthed decades later. Through Freedom of Information requests and whistleblower accounts tell a different story. Ford engineers built a test mule that produced horsepower with nothing more than a better cam profile. Higher compression and slightly ported heads. Chevy's prototypes hit horsepower using a reworked intake and small tweaks to ignition timing and exhaust scavenging. These weren't fantasy numbers. These were dyno verified with test cars built, driven, and quietly buried. Why? Because if the public found out that a humble 6-cylinder could keep up with or even outperform a small block, well, who'd pay more for the V? There are real stories about engineers quitting in protest. I spent months designing a high-flow cylinder head for that boosted airflow by percent. It was cheap to cast, simple to bolt on. They shelved it without explanation. I handed in my badge the next week. Anonymous GM engineer interview archived in a performance bulletin. Leaked GM memo even reveals the hyperpack prototype high-compression pistons, aggressive cam, for barrel carb. Output horsepower, pound-feet torque, dyno-tested, killed by management. Why? It outpulled the base real mechanic. Quote, "I've rebuilt that ran me on diesel oil and kerosene. Chevy cast these blocks so thick you could crack a piston and still drive home." Another Ford insider described a prototype variable valve timing setup for the years before Honda made it cool. It boosted fuel efficiency by percent and widened the power band across extra RPM, but right before it was approved, gone. Files sealed, budget pulled, gas crisis, missed opportunity, then came the oil crisis. And suddenly, Detroit needed fuel-efficient workhorses. It was the perfect moment to lean into tough, frugal 6-cylinders that could haul without draining a tank. Did they pivot? Nope. They doubled down on gas-guzzling Versas, because Versas still meant bigger profits, and bigger profits meant shareholder smiles. The 6s stayed detuned, choked by restrictive intakes, conservative cams, and emissions gear that strangled their potential. Let's be real, there was never a technical reason these engines couldn't perform. The Chevy HyperAx slant proved that with the right tuning, a straight 6 could beat Versas at Daytona in the earlies. But Ford and GM weren't interested in breaking their own pecking order. They needed the 6s to look rugged, but act mild. That's how you sell more trucks with available VAP grades, badges. The N were underdogs by design, deliberately sidelined, so that bigger engines could bask in the spotlight. But the truth, these weren't underdogs. They were sleeping giants, overbuilt, undertuned, and buried under corporate politics. Had they been allowed to evolve, we might have seen factory turbocharged straight sixes in pickups by muscle-era drag-spec inline sixes turning heads at the strip, smog-era trucks still getting plus miles per gallon without FE or downsizing, and a generation of DIY tuners rallying behind these engines as budget vehiclers. Instead, they became legends, not because of how they were sold, but because of what they endured and what they could have been. The shadow racers, mechanics, and drivers who defied Detroit. While Ford and Chevy were busy selling V-Dreams, but deep in the underground, street warriors had a secret weapon. Inline sixes with hidden fire. In Ohio, mechanic and racer Dave Stoll tore up expectations. He stuffed a modified Chevy into a gasser, ported head, twin Carter carbs, and no apologies. At Milan Dragway, he posted a second mile at MPH, faster than many in a six-cylinder in a truck. The drag community couldn't believe it. Stoll later said it ran with Versish and laughed, leaving them. The factory scoffed, but the locals saw the future. A six-cylinder could beat the big dogs. Then came Walker Evans, the Baja legend, who quietly flipped the script. He entered a privateer Ford, F-powered by a stock inline crew chief, Jim Smith recalls. We didn't touch the bottom end, just headers, a cam, and a bigger radiator. That truck finished TH overall, ahead of VC and competitors. Ford didn't clap. They quietly sent a cease and desist to Evans. Don't embarrass our engines like this again. It wasn't a fluke. In a Chevy L of Witha in a Sika showroom stock, B won 3 straight races, the smallest engine in the field, undefeated. In a Ford F, running a inline claimed class victory at the brutal Nora. Mexican beating trucks with bigger cylinders only by staying alive. The cult of the six, modern resurrection. Today, builders exploit Detroit's over-engineering. Vintage Inline's FE kit wakes the Clifford Performance's aluminum heads. Let the breathe. Result, plus HP sleepers, better cams, mild porting. An upgraded carburetor or throttle bodies woke up these engines without sacrificing the reliability they were famous for. A simple cam swap on a Chevy could shift its torque curve upward, add another horsepower, and give it a more responsive mid-range, while a better flowing head and intake could push it even further. Ford's, thanks to its wide torque band and larger bore, responded equally well to bolt-in mods like performance headers, intake spacers, and aftermarket ignition systems. Both engines had robust factory internals, which meant enthusiasts didn't have to open the bottom end unless they were chasing serious numbers. The forged steel crankshafts, generous main bearings, and heavy-duty blocks were more than ready for high-output duty. Builders discovered you could rev the past RPM with balanced internals and that could hold together at RPM with upgraded valve train components. These were no longer just truck engines. They were performance platforms hiding in plain sight. By the S&S, the INLINE rebellion was in full swing. Budget dirt track racers embraced especially in classes where verses were either restricted or too expensive. With a little headwork, a high lift cam, and a properly jetted carb, that became a torque monster that dominated quarter-mile dirt ovals. It was cheaper to build, cheaper to fix, and just as fast. Drag racers joined the fray too. Turbocharged S, running stock blocks with forged pistons, and blow-through carb setups recorded second quarter-mile times. One Kansas-based builder reported running in a Chevy 2 consistent S on slicks with methanol injection. Weren't far behind. Mildly built fuel-injected setups with ported heads and nitrous broke into the low seconds and high seconds. The engines held up pass after pass. Chuck Knighton, a Midwest engine builder known in enthusiast circles, became a legend in the S4 crafting naturally aspirated heads that flowed like verses. One of his builds hit horsepower without forced induction using a hand-ported cylinder head, custom cam, and forged internals. His work was so impressive that GM allegedly sent him a cease and desist letter when he tried to market his redesigned heads, a move that only added to his underground notoriety. Meanwhile, down in Australia, where inline S were embraced rather than suppressed, both the Ford and Chevy found a second life. Ford were imported in limited numbers and fitted to Falcons, where they held their own in endurance races from 2. They also gained popularity on Aussie oval tracks where racers prized its RPM potential and easy parts availability. With local engine builders adapting American speed parts to Australian rules, the inline scene flourished. Cult status and modern upgrades. Fast forward to the S, and these engines are enjoying a renaissance. Restorers and builders are pushing them beyond anything Ford or GM imagined.
At
A mint condition Ford can command dollar to dollar, while Chevy, especially those with early separate intake manifolds, are climbing toward dollar and beyond. This isn't just nostalgia, it's recognition of real performance value. The aftermarket is thriving again. Companies like Vintage INLINE's Clifford Performance and Langdon Stovebolt now offer EFI conversions for both engines. High-flow aluminum intake manifolds, roller rocker arms and valve train upgrades, custom cams and forged pistons and turbo kits pushing to SI safely. With these modern tweaks, it's now possible to build a plus-horsepower inline that still idles smoothly, pulls like a freight train, and lasts me with basic maintenance. Forums are now buzzing with younger gearheads, discovering the simplicity, torque, and aftermarket goldmine of the Ford and Chevy. Some compare them to modern engines for their balance and bulletproof reputation. Both GM and Ford have borrowed inline tech from their past for modern platforms. The Ford EcoBoost's direct injection and chamber shape echoes of experiments from the SGM's small turbocharged inline engines. They mimic the four-stroke ratios that gave the its muscle. So, what started as humble truck engines have now become cult legends. Verified weapons of evidence, corporate sabotage, Ford's Project Ghost termination order, GM's Hyperpack cancellation memo, rebel testimony. Walker Evans Baja cease desist, Dave Stoll's NH ban threat, engineering proof Ford block casting thickness. Inverse modern EcoBoosts, S-forged crank metallurgy matches Corvette L Global Insurgency Dick Johnson S-Borst Falcon lap times versus. This is Paul from Rare Car Stories. Question everything. Catch you next time.